coming tonight for the first session of what we think will be a semester of very stimulating presentations and dialogue. My name is Ted Lansmark. I am an associate professor here, and I'm director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. For those of you who weren't here last semester, we spent last semester focusing on planning issues for the city of Boston, and over the course of the semester, I was approached by my colleagues at the law school who said, you're doing some really interesting stuff there, and boy, do we have a subject for you that might be of some public interest. And so we had a few conversations, and I will defer to them for significant parts of this semester, because they've assembled a group of experts on the question of what is the role of the rule of law in a time of turmoil. It is our hope and expectation that as many of you as possible will come to these sessions and become very actively engaged in the dialogue. As I mentioned to our matriculating students who meet for about an hour prior to this session, the pace of change in the world will never be this slow again. And for those of us who have been committed to moving forward with questions and issues of law and public policy, the pace of change has been not only tumultuous but positively disorienting in ways that have caused many of us to ask, what's real? What's stable? What do we agree upon in terms of the law, and what role should the rule of law play as we move forward? So I will just note that you will have opportunities to hear and engage with dialogue through the course of this semester in ways that will not only challenge what we know of the past, but raise some interesting questions about how we move forward in terms of the application of rule of law, particularly in this country, but also in other nations and in cyberspace. With that, I would make one other note. At the beginning of each course, I ask that if folks have particular questions that they would hope we might address over the course of the semester, you get that information to me, preferably earlier rather than later in the semester, so that we can try to make some adjustments and accommodations to try to do the best that we can to address the kinds of questions that you want to see us address. And with that, I'm happy to turn the microphone over to our law school dean. We all agreed that we would keep our introductions brief. You can read about us online, or you can look at the introductions up there. But it is really, for me, a tremendous pleasure to introduce a colleague who has done extraordinary work as dean of our law school, who is much respected by his peers and faculty, and who clearly has developed great working relationships with our students who have gone out into the world to do wonderful things. So with that, I introduce Dean Jeremy Paul.
Welcome everyone to the Spring 2018 Open Classroom. As Professor Lansmark has said, my name is Jeremy Paul, and I have the honor of serving as Dean of the Law School here at Preventive Detention. I'd like to thank Professor Lansmark, Director of the Dukakis Center, for providing me and my law school colleagues, Professors Wendy Parnett and Dan Ehrman, the chance to guide this semester's focus on the rule of law in an age of polarization and rapid change. We did not choose the topic lightly. Like everyone in America who follows the news, we've been troubled by the loss of bipartisan spirit in the halls of government, by breaches of long-standing unwritten rules that have long kept political discourse within bounds, and by a heightened sense that the country has entered into uncharted waters. We know that politics has always had a rough and tumble quality, and we don't want to overreact to every tweet. Yet we suspect many in our audience share our sense of how challenging it has become to differentiate between ordinary charges that political parties have long leveled against each other and deeper changes that will threaten our system of democratic government. We expect this open classroom to provide all of us the chance to step back and explore in greater depth what has come to be known as the rule of law, whether it's truly in peril, and if so, what, if anything, we might do about it. In the first instance, this inquiry will require us to go back to basic principles and reason together about what we mean by the rule of law. And of course, one of the remarkable things about the rule of law is that to function successfully, it must be understood by laypersons and lawyers alike. A surgical patient will do better if she knows what to expect, but she need not grasp the techniques her surgeon employs nor the theory behind them in order for the operation to be a success. For law to function, however, those governed by it must understand its edicts and generally be prepared to comply with them. So we want to start tonight's session by enlisting each of you in helping us to generate a collective sense of what is meant by the rule of law. So we're going to hand out index cards to everyone. We have them over here. And we're asking that you take a few minutes, write down on the card some of the key attributes that you identify with the rule of law. We don't need a formal definition, just enough so that we get a sense of what you see as law's key elements. If you feel comfortable doing so, write your first name on the cards, and we'll give you all a few minutes and then we'll collect them. Thank you. So thank you all for participating in this exercise. It's still a little early in the evening for me to launch into a long-winded description of the rule of law. But so let me just start with one simple attribute that seems to be at the root of many of the others. The whole idea of the rule of law, what is often called the rule of law and not men, and of course not women either, is that those with lawmaking power, frequently legislatures in our system, write down in advance the rules that will govern conduct. A familiar example might be drive on the right side of the road. If I'm driving on the left, a police officer will pull me over and give me a ticket. If I fight the ticket in court, the judge can pull out the rule book, in which case the traffic laws, see that I'm in the wrong, and order me to pay a fine. From this vantage point, the rule of law seems very simple. The rules are written first, and then they are either complied with or not. The system has two very powerful advantages. First, as a citizen, if the rules are readily available in a rule book, I know what's allowed, what I can do and what I can't, and I can govern my conduct accordingly. And second, when powerful governmental officials are acting upon me, deciding, for example, whether I must go to jail, the rule book should protect me against arbitrary action. If I am a U.S. citizen, for example, I cannot be deported to another country simply because immigration officials don't like the content of my views or the color of my skin. We intuitively grasp the nature of the rule book structure because it resembles those governing other aspects of life, such as rules of the game, like chess or baseball. Some moves are permitted, and some are not. But to stay in the game, the players must follow the rules. And as we'll see in a few minutes, the similarity between the rules of law and the rules of the game were famously invoked by Chief Justice Roberts during his confirmation hearings. It turns out, however, that this seemingly simple concept of a rule book has more twists and turns than we might first have imagined. Ultimately, what this means is that we have to work harder together to make the rule of law function as we hope it will. But first, we need to grasp the essence of what makes law a topic of endless fascination in which we are always striving for a better rule of law, but always finding ways further to travel. And to see this, I'm going to enlist you in yet another exercise. So here's your situation. You have a roommate, some of you do, some of you don't. And you have an agreement One of you is gonna cook dinner. So you're gonna leave a list on the table. Your roommate's gonna come home, pick up the list, take it to the store, and buy the things, take them home, and make them for dinner. So you all still have pens now, we're gonna get, so make your list, 5 items on your list. You have a minute to make five items on your list.
You took our cards.
You don't need a card, write anything, get another write. You need more cards? Yes. The CIA says 7, oh, I shouldn't go away from it. The CIA says that you can remember 7 things at a time, right? So 5 and so. All right. Who has a list? Raise your hand if you have a list done. Okay. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Yaren.
I'm sorry?
Yaren.
Yaren. What's on your list?
Chicken legs, carrots, onion, garlic.
Wait, louder, much louder.
Chicken legs, carrots, onion, garlic, soy sauce.
Okay, that's pretty good. All right. Chicken legs, carrots, onions, garlic, and soy sauce. All right, you've got the list. You have her list. You're in the store. All right. What kind of onions do you buy? Mm-hmm.
Chicken legs.
What kind of?
No, what?
No, what kind of onions?
Oh, what kind of onions? She didn't mention what kind, so.
I know she did.
Yellow onions.
Yellow onions. Good guess? Okay, soy sauce. What kind of soy sauce do you get? Regular soy sauce. Okay, what's on your list?
My list?
Yep.
Eggs,
Uh-huh.
butter, onions, mushrooms, and cheese.
Oh, okay, great, okay. So you have his list. What kind of cheese do you get?
Oh.
You.
American.
American cheese. Bad choice, right? So you see the point, right? So this is a situation in which people are seeking to cooperate with each other. They're doing just the same thing I just described by the rule of law, right? I'm gonna write something down, it's gonna be written down, and then you later are gonna follow it. You wanna work together to get a nice dinner, and yet, it's unlikely. By the way, I never go to the grocery store anymore without my cell phone, because if I have my wife's list and I screw it up, I'm done, right? But people don't generally write lists that are specifically detailed enough so that you know what I have to do. Now, what was great about your list was you could imagine putting the items together into a recipe so that you might actually be able to infer, well, if you're making chicken legs, what kind of onions go good with that, right? That's a strategy that lawyers use all the time in order to figure out how to interpret documents. But as you can see, this is a classic problem. Right? Now, here's another problem. You said butter was on your list. Right? So now let me ask you this question. Let's say you live in a family where you never have butter because you're health conscious, and you only eat margarine. You and your roommate never ever have butter. And you pick up the list, and the list says butter. How many people are going to buy butter? Just you? Okay. All right. How many are going to buy margarine? And the rest of you would not buy anything. But you see the point, right? So think of pity the poor legislature trying to get people to follow the law when you wrote down butter and half the people in the room are buying margarine. Right? And of course, you know you're doomed, right? If you buy butter, right, your roommate's going to say, "Why do you want butter? We never get that." And of course, I buy margarine. I just wrote butter because with fewer letters. And if you buy margarine, your roommate's going to say, "I'm baking a cake for the school play. I need butter for the." So you can't win, right? But you see the point, right? Now here's another one. You're on your way out the door, and you see a second grocery list stapled to the refrigerator. Or not staple, matching to the refrigerator. Are you going to take that list too and buy those items also, or not? How many will buy those too? right? And how many won't? Okay, so this is like another classic legal problem. There's a new statute, and there's an old statute. And the question is, do they both apply, or one or the other, and how are you gonna deal with it? So even the simplest human exercise, like going to the grocery store, creates problems in interpretation. So that the rule of law, which we prize so deeply as a fundamental part of our system, has built into it this ambiguity. That doesn't mean we should give up. Please don't take from this the idea, oh my God, the law can never work. Because of course it can. It's just harder than it might have seemed originally. All right, so that's our second exercise. And now, you know, if you're running a city or a state or a country, using written language to try to govern that, and you've got different people, different needs, different aims, it's a lot harder. So we need a robust legal profession. You knew the dean of the law school was going to say, robust legal profession, in order to work this out. And those at the top of the profession, including the justices on our Supreme Court, share a deep faith and commitment to making the rule of law work. You'll see as from the clip we're about to show, they have different views on what exactly the rule of law means. You'll hear in these clips comments from a law professor, testimony from the Chief Justice of the United States during his confirmation hearings, as I mentioned, drawing an analogy between judging and being a baseball umpire, and comments from Justice Breyer about Federalist 78. So as you listen to these clips, ask yourself the following questions. This is related to the cards you just filled out. What do the speakers see as the key components of the rule of law? What functions do they expect the rule of law to serve? And what people and institutions need to be in place in order to ensure that the rule of law prevails? When the clips are over, my colleague Wendy Parmet will lead you in a discussion of ideas about the rule of law that you submitted in the cards. And then I'll come back and give you some of our ideas about the rule of law and give you a preview of what's going to come for the rest of the open classroom semester, and then we'll have a discussion. All right, so thank you all very much. Now I need to start the clips.
Your comments. So we typed them into a nifty program. We didn't type the whole things, but these are the words, and by the size of the words, you can see visually the frequency, which I think is really interesting. So knowing that when IT comes, we're going to have to stop this conversation, or at least stop looking at this, because they're going to need the screen. But interesting, right? So law, I guess that makes sense, because we're talking about the rule of law, so that seems to be the number one. But function, that's an interesting one. Did somebody use the word function? Yeah, why did you do that?
Well, because law serves, like, it functions as a way of society, ruling their citizens.
So law is, the rule of law involves law having a purpose in society? It's a utilitarian thing? It's something we use,
I
maybe?
wouldn't say utilitarian, but yeah.
Anyone? Anyone else use function? Yeah, somebody else did. But, you know, could be also, no doubt, was used as a verb. Law functions as, so maybe we should go.
Functioning is also there, but it's smaller.
Oh, where?
Underneath rule.
Underneath.
Bottom right, near the bottom.
Got it. What about society? I actually saw that came up in a lot. Is the rule of law the same thing in every society? What's its relationship to society? Some people seem to think that the rule of law serve a function. Yeah.
It's agreed upon by society.
Agreed upon. Agreement. So it's whatever we say it is? Do we all have to agree?
We all have to agree to buy into the idea of the rule of law, the way that we agree to like a monetary system. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Okay. Yes, in the back.
I don't believe that the rule of law is necessarily just about agreeing. I don't think that all the time it's about agreeing. I think it's people with power are
said chosen by the people. In a society, in a state that is not a democracy, could a monarchy or aristocracy or autocracy have the rule of law?
Yes,
You say
yes.
because,
If the rules are followed and affect all from the top down, and there's an independent judiciary, yeah,
yes,
With society, the rule of law governs society often and affects society, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with the fact that it always agrees with society.
wait, I'm very bad at it. Say that again?
I said with the rule of law, it affects society and often governs society, but I would also disagree that it doesn't necessarily always agree with society.
Doesn't always agree with society? Do you mean society doesn't always agree with
Society
it?
doesn't always agree with it.
It can be imposed on people.
Absolutely.
Is that the rule of law? So what is, somebody wrote here, that the rule of law is to guarantee freedom. How many people would think that's a key component?
That's pretty vague.
It is. Well, all of these are somewhat, right? Because we're trying to figure this out. Somebody else wrote, it has to be applied equally to all. Is that? But you said you could have the rule of law with a authoritarian or a monarch?
Yep.
How can it be applied equally to all with a monarch?
if the law applies to all, we're assuming a constitutional monarch,
Oh, constitutional, okay.
or even a benign dictator, I suppose, could follow the rules. In Greece, they elected their dictators.
Okay.
We're splitting hairs.
No, I think it's actually a really interesting, hard question. What's the relationship between the rule of law and democracy? As we prepared this semester and looked at a lot of readings and talked to people, one of the things that came up is people use democracy and the rule of law and constitutionalism interchangeably, but are they the same things? Right? Can you have one without the other? Right? Question. You know, I lost my,
You lost your word cloud.
I lost my word cloud, that's, right? Where does the rule of law come from? What?
From Aristotle.
From Aristotle? Okay. It's a nice historical approach, right? Where does a society get its rule of law? From consensus? Government? Did you say governance or government? Government,
Custom,
custom.
which leads
I
to,
think it's by agreement. It's not necessarily you agree on the law, but you agree to be bound by the law.
Okay,
I
Yes.
think it could just be power, though. You wouldn't have to agree for one government to take over another government. It's not an agreement, it's the power that sets the rule of law, in my opinion.
Do you agree?
I think that if you substitute the word agree for like recognize, it like starts to make more sense. If people recognize the power as like authoritative, and whether that be because they're coerced to, then like you have a rule of law.
so one's acceptance of it could come from coercion or power, or from the internalization of the norms, or just agreement, but you think we could pick any of those. Interesting, yes, in the back.
You don't necessarily need to agree to laws to be bound by them. Like if when you're a baby and you're born in the hospital, you're not necessarily agreeing to the rule of law before you can even understand it, but there's certain protocols and things that happen in the hospital that happen to you that are bound by the rule of law. So you don't necessarily have to agree to be born into society or
think about as we go on is, what does consent mean? Like, a lot of, I think, right, a lot of, you've talked about consent, agreement, right, that was a big one up there. And yet, what does that actually mean? Because as you say, you know, most of us don't sign on the dotted line in the hospital, you know, when we're babies. Most people don't actually ever formally agree to be bound by the rule of law. I suppose lawyers do when we take our oath. Presidents do when they are inaugurated. Judges do. Immigrants who become naturalized citizens do. But most people don't ever actually do a formal agreement. So what does it mean to agree? And it certainly doesn't mean to accept to like everything. Yeah.
I think in order to be a part of a society, then you must agree to its norms. So in order to become a part of American society, then you subject yourself to a couple of norms and cultures, whether it's being, stopping with the police and agreeing, to your relationship with the police, or subjecting yourself to other things in order to become part of that and enjoy that.
Do you think you have to consciously agree, or
be
just this is the way it is and we kind of accept it and we?
I think that's the vast majority.
Tacit agreement.
Tacit agreement.
Carefully explaining that in our system, the Constitution is a framework constitution. It's very short. It sets up institutions, but it doesn't have a lot of clear rules. And so there's a lot of things that you need besides the Constitution in order to have a rule of law. But picking up now on the discussion that has been started, it's pretty clear that several people made a comment the rule of law is eroding. I thought, by the way, your point that the rule of law is not really eroding because we're all still obeying the law is an excellent point. And it really illustrates one of the points that I think Professor Parmet was trying to make, is that sometimes when we think of the rule of law, we think about rules that govern how we treat each other. That part of the rule of law seems, my favorite example is it's still the case that when you show up at the airport and you go to the baggage claim, and there's all these suitcases. For a while, they had people who checked, does your ticket match? Now, you can just pick up anything and walk away, and no one's ever going to catch you. And almost nobody ever does that, right? So we still actually have a culture of people being rule-abiding. But a completely different sense of the rule of law is not what the rules are governing each other, but do we have institutions in place that can protect us against powerful people taking advantage of us? And that's a very different sense of the rule of law from the one that governs each of us, each other.
Jeremy, let me ask you, this says work either. Let me ask you a question. It snowed a lot recently. And some people work really hard to dig out their cars. When they put a chair or something in that space. And in some neighborhoods within Boston, there's a rule of law in effect, a shared understanding that that's okay. Where I live in JP, it's okay.
It's okay to put a chair there.
It's okay to put a chair there.
And reserve the space.
And reserve the space, right? And in fact, neighbors will enforce it. In other neighborhoods, not so much. So it's not as though the law-abiding citizens necessarily have a shared understanding of what the rules are when it snows in Boston. Some folks do, and some folks don't. You said a moment ago that on an individual level, we're all pretty much law-abiding. Why is that? And why does that apply in some places rather than in others? When my neighbors, for example, when I couldn't go out and shoveled out their walkways and dumped all of their excess snow in front of my driveway so I couldn't get out. Right? Why didn't I then take all of that snow, which is now piled up 6 feet high, and dump it back on their property.
He's a nice guy, right? No, there's a lot in that question, and I think that it's useful to think about those questions. And what I mean by that is you've talked both about the difference between formal laws and informal mores, customs. One of the examples I use with my property students all the time is if you're driving in a parking lot and you're now sitting there waiting for a space as you see someone pull out, and I come in and cut you off and take the space, I'm not a nice guy. I have clearly breached customs morals, but there's no law that says that I can't do that. And if you were to retaliate for that by keying my car, you would get in trouble, and I wouldn't, because now you've crossed the line and you've broken the law. So that's one thing in your question. But then the other thing in your question is, why do some people cheat and some people don't cheat? Right? Because you can cheat with respect to some people speed and some people don't. That's a formal law. And part of it is how likely are you to get caught versus how likely are you not to be caught. All of these things are connected to the theme of this open classroom in the following way. Remember, we started off by saying that the course here is about polarization. And I don't know if you can put those, I have slides about polarization. I don't know if you can put those on the screen. But here's an example, which I think is all we really need to make a point. In 1958, Gallup asked a random sample of Americans what kind of man people wanted their daughters to marry. 58, sexist, whatever. A Democrat or a Republican. And the question read, if you had a daughter of marriageable age, would you prefer she marry a Democrat or a Republican? All other things being equal. 18% said Democrat, 10% said Republican, and 72% said they couldn't give a thing, right? Who cares, right? But recently, in 2016, UCLA political science professor Lynn Babreck asked a similar question. She was more modern and said son or daughter. And now, all of a sudden, things are very different. 28% said Democrat, 27% said Republican, only 45% didn't care. And even more than that, in 1958, 33% of Democrats wanted their daughter to marry a Democrat, and 25% wanted their daughter to marry a Republican. But in 2016, 60% of Democrats and 63% of Republicans felt very strongly that you should marry someone of the same political party. So that's just one example of polarization. And we have slides that show dramatic changes over the last 50 years. So that it used to be we had a bell curve and most were in the middle, and now there's lots of people on the conservative side and lots of people on the liberal side, and the middle is shrinking. And that changes things. Now, how does that connect to your example about the snow thing? Go back to the grocery list. Right? So if you and your roommate get along, your goal for the grocery list is figure out what does my roommate really want, right? What kind of cheese is going to go good with the omelet? But suppose your roommate hate each other. Right? Now you're going to figure out what cheese is going to really make that person miserable. And when they complain, you're going to hold up the list and you're going to say, "But you wrote cheese and I got cheese, so I didn't." Because now all of a sudden the words don't do you any good. And if you think this is just a homey example, here's a real world example of that. In very recent times, and Professor Perman knows a lot more about this than I do, but I haven't had the mic in a moment. The Affordable Care Act had a provision in it which said that if you buy your insurance on an exchange, you'll get a tax credit. And the statute set up rules that said states have an option to set up these exchanges, and if they don't, then the federal government can set up an exchange. But when they actually wrote the statute, the provision of the tax credits only said an exchange created by a state. So if your state didn't have one and you used the federal exchange, The actual literal language of the statute meant you could get the tax credits, which would unravel the statute in your state. If people all agreed and we're trying to make the Affordable Care Act work, everyone would have said, well, they made a mistake, but we all know what they meant. But of course, people didn't agree. In fact, polarization around the Affordable Care Act was intense. So it got litigated all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court because the people who wanted to take down the act were willing to treat the literal language. So to go back to your question, whether you're going to shovel the snow, respect the snow, depends a lot on what are your relationships with your neighbors. And if they're strong relationships, you can dream shoveling snow on them.
And there's a bigger, or at least a related question I would ask, which is, to what extent does the rule of law rely upon how you care about your neighbors? And who your neighbors are?
Me?
Yes, you.
Sir.
So I'm a little frustrated. There's the rule of law, then there's something called due process of law, which usually involves certain observed principles, like an individual cannot be detained unless he's been imprisoned unless proven guilty. Preventive detention is not traditionally part of the due process of law, yet in various countries, preventive detention is practiced. Actually, preventive detention is characteristic of the rules of law in war, where prisoners are taken on suspicion of, on grounds that would not be considered part of a legal due process. And that's why the issue of Guantanamo, the Guantanamo prison is so pressing, because actually we're detaining these people as if we were in a state of war, which arguably we have been, but there doesn't seem to be any path to get us out of that state of hostilities. How would we know that we were out of that state of hostilities? The state of war has never been declared legally. It's just we were kind of panicked into it.
And in effect, we've said, oh, never mind.
Yeah, exactly. In effect, we said, never mind, and let's not think about it and talk about it. But actually, it's very important because, for example, people now are detained in the United States without trial because they can't raise bail. There was a guy, as some of you know, who was detained for 2 years in, I think, Rikers Island. And he was abused there, and they finally, because he didn't have the money to raise to pay for his bail.
Okay, let me try to answer that. First of all, for coming attractions, the Ferguson report is very much about that bail issue. And we're having the author of the Ferguson report as one of our speakers. So I'm frustrated too. And this really gets back to the core of what we're hoping to accomplish with this open classroom. So you picked a particular set of examples, very salient, Guantanamo, which trouble you, and perhaps I think they might trouble many people in the audience. And you want to talk about, are they legitimate in some way? And one of the ways to talk about that is, has the government in this particular instance failed to comply either with due process, which I would describe as an element of the rule of law, or with the rule of law altogether? That issue comes up every time that one political party is dissatisfied with the actions of another. And one of the things that we want to talk about in this classroom is, when is the right charge against your political opponents? We disagree with you. And when is the right charge against your political opponents? You've breached the rule of law. If you invoke the rule of law all the time, your ability to use it will diminish. So you got to be careful about when you use it and when you don't. When the Senate changed its filibuster rules, something that made me sad, the Senate has changed filibuster rules many times. It was a decision, it was a political decision, but it wasn't a breach of the rule of law. It was just a change. And one of the things that we're going to try to do in the semester is not allow every, I disagree with this, therefore it's a breach of the rule of law. But instead, talk about, when it really matters. Now, the flip side of that, when people come to hear these discussions, what is the rule of law, how does it mean, what does it mean, is there's this concern, this is an overly abstract discussion. What does it really matter what the rule of law means? And I guess my reaction to that is it really does matter a lot. And here's a really homey example. I like homey examples. So imagine that you're trying to get your young adult child to come back and visit you for Thanksgiving. And the child said, I can't come this year, I'm going to the in-laws, I have too much work. And you bring out the big guns and you say, my goodness, don't you understand what it means for us to be a family? If for us to be a family, you've got to come and visit us on Thanksgiving. If you say that, you've got to be prepared for the kid to come back to you and say, I thought what it meant to be a family is that when I made a tough decision about competing priorities, you were going to support me. And now I see that you're not. And so this is a problem. So it might be wiser instead to be a little bit more different. Well, you can't really come for Thanksgiving all together, but could you stop by for an hour, right? If I was saying it, I might say, make your mom happy, right? And that might be more effective, it might work. But if you do that, you've kind of conceded that, it doesn't really require a full visit for Thanksgiving. And then all of a sudden it's your next holiday, Hanukkah or Christmas or whatever holiday you celebrate. And now your son or daughter will say to you, well, we've already established that I don't have to visit on a holiday for us to be a family. Next thing you know, your spouse is sick in the hospital and you want your kid to visit. And say, well, I don't have to come visit because it doesn't really mean anything to be a family. Slowly but surely, like a frog in the boiling water, right? It didn't jump out, but now all of a sudden there's no abstraction left. And that same thing, that same style of thing, can happen to the rule of law if you allow it to be violated once. So Guantanamo, by the way, is a great example. I mean, what you said about what we've forgotten about, we kind of have forgotten about it, right? President Obama, every year in the State of the Union address, I'm not sure if you've all seen the clips, but every year he said, and we're going to close Guantanamo. And every year they didn't close it, and every year he said it again. Now, I'm not saying it was his fault. He obviously didn't have complete control because we have a rule of law, and our president is not a dictator.
But let me ask you a question about that, because something you just said really kind of concerns me.
Yep.
You said directly and/or implied that the rule of law, if it's invoked too much, becomes diluted. Why is that? I mean, if it's a rule of law, then I'm not saying you want to overdo the guilt about showing up for Thanksgiving. You'll break your mother's heart if you're not here to share turkey with her. But you've said very directly, if you overuse it, then it's not so much a rule anymore, it's like a recommendation.
Right, so why is that?
Yeah.
At least two reasons. One, sometimes you're using it wrong. So to go back to our discussion about the snow, you're claiming it's a rule of law, but really it's not. It's really just a norm or politics or something like that. And the second one is that there are all kinds of rules, like the example that Professor Parmentier used about driving, right? If people are driving 65 or 70 in a 55 zone, they're breaking the law, but if the cops allow it, the rule of law has not ended, right? So both of those things are in fact examples.
Well, what's your example? Why is that a rule or a law? It's what you want to happen. It has nothing to do with the rule of law, whether your kid visits you on Thanksgiving.
No, I changed the example from the rule of law to what it means to be a family. It's an abstraction, right? believe me, parents and all kinds of people use abstractions like that all the time, right? So, because they work, exactly, yeah. So I really want you to come, right? That's one level. And don't you understand what it means for us to be a family, right? Now, you might say that's a really manipulative thing to say, right? But nonetheless, that's what I mean by overuse, right? Similarly, you know, to take some of the examples that we're going to go through later in the semester, when the Senate voted down Robert Bork. Some of you are old enough to remember this. Many of you are not, right? The Republicans said, this is a breach, right? Because he was qualified, and you voted against him anyway. So was it a breach, or was it just they lost, right? And then all the way up to now, when the Republicans refused to nominate, or even refused to vote on Merrick Garland, was that a breach of the rule of law? Was it? What? So you're all saying yes, but clearly, right, within the formal rules, if it was really a breach, why didn't everybody go crazy? Because of polarization, right, which is part of the problem, but also because there's enough ambiguity in it that it's the Senate that votes to confirm, and the Senate refused to take it up. And here's what the Constitution does not say, and this is what I mean by a framework Constitution. The Constitution does not say the Senate will give advice and consent within 3 months, right? Because if it said that, then it would be a much different, they still might have not done it, and then who's going to enforce it? But to go back now to the conversation we had before about citizens, right? We take for granted that we have in this country at least the kind of rule of law that if you picked up and stole her purse right in front of everybody, it wouldn't be these people, they're the tech police, but the real police would come, give her purse back, and take you away, right? And we all feel at least, I want to be clear, because I felt really bad about your comment before. There's general law abiding in the country, but there's not universal, right? We all know that, you know. But then the other thing that we count on the rule of law for is to protect us. So if the police came in here and dragged someone out for no reason, you know, you're chewing gum, and the cops come in and they say, "Oh, you're chewing gum. We're going to put you under arrest." In our system, they can't do that. Why not? Because there's no law against chewing gum, right? In order to be able to go back to your question about being detained, there's got to be a law against it, or you can't do it. That's another crucial component of what the rule of law is. And that's the formal law, right? But then, to go back to Professor Permensik, there's a whole lot of other things that keep the powers that be in check, including norms, including reason, right? We tend to believe that if the country looks at its leaders and says, what do you mean you're taking us to war because there's weapons of mass destruction, and there aren't any weapons of mass destruction, that people are going to be held accountable. One of the things that's very scary about our current moment, and this is connected to a broader notion of rule of law, which is why these terms are blurred all the time, is we can't hold our leaders accountable. And a key technique for holding people accountable is saying to them, what you're doing doesn't make any sense. But if the current occupant of the White House takes the position, I don't need to make sense. I can tell you that my inauguration crowd is bigger than President Obama's, and right in front of your eyes it's not, but I can say it again. And I can tell you over and over and over again that President Obama was born in Kenya. And when I say it, and I can't prove it, and I have no evidence, I'll say it again, and I'll keep saying it. And no matter how many times I'm proved wrong, I'll just keep saying it. That is not the same kind of thing as refusing to comply with a written law.
And if you can't hold people accountable, what are the consequences, particularly in a democracy? And you know, before we wrap today, and I want to hear from Dan and Wendy on this, we also want to talk very briefly about the specific substantive areas that we will be talking about in subsequent classes. Because we are dealing with issues of intellectual property. And very specific kinds of issues that are changing very rapidly around us, in large part because the assumptions that we've made about the role of the rule of law in this country as it stands as a model of democracy around the world are eroding, as many of you have noted. And eroding in a way where many of us feel that we need to do something. I mean, the entertainment aspect, the entertainment value of listening for the next weird tweet has, I think, run its course. And so now the question is, what are the tools we have to right a ship that is in very turbulent waters? And we can talk about it in this room, but the real question is, what is it that we need to do as citizens, not just to be able to see a tax return, but to feel, for example, that questions of conflict of interest, as they may be affecting foreign policy, given what the rule of law has said, are the ways in which we negotiate and play a role as a world leader, are being eroded. That's what we're going to be talking about over the course of this semester.
Unshockingly, Chief Justice Roberts, at his 2005 nomination hearing, and then Justice Breyer, about 10 years later, both focused on judicial independence as a core feature of the rule of law. That's something that we are going to explore throughout the entire course, basically about what judges have to do with it, right? So we can see this here. I just wanted to, and you'll see this is a contested concept, right? We're going to work to define what the rule of law is together this semester. So let me just do a brief overview of each weekly session. Basically, the rule is show up here on Wednesday evenings, except for one session which I want to highlight, when our speaker, who's a tremendous speaker, is only available on a Monday evening. But let me just go through it right now. So today is January 10th. What is the rule of law? Is it real? Next week, we're going to have Mark Tushnet talk to us about judicial review, the theme that we saw Justices Roberts and Breyer highlight during their speeches. And week 3, which is January 24th, what happens when there is no rule of law, with examples of the rule of law under authoritarian regimes, so touching on those questions. Can you have a benevolent dictator and the like? And we'll have Jeffrey Birds and Margaret Wu from Northeastern talking about that. On January 31st, we're going to talk about the challenges posed by economic inequality and stagnation with 2 experts, Barry Bluestone, who's a professor here at Northeastern, and Robert Kuttner, who founded and is the editor of the American Prospect. The special meeting is next. That is on a Monday. Rick Perlstein, the author of the award-winning book Nixonland, is going to take us back to the 1960s and 1968 in particular, and see if we have any lessons we can learn from what was happening in American society then, and if they are relevant today. Again, that's going to be Monday, same time, and we're actually able to reserve this room as well. So same time, same place, just a different day. On February 14th, we're going to explore the role of partisanship. You heard Dean Paul talk a little bit about the Bork nomination and the effect that that has had. Is the Supreme Court just another political or partisan branch? We're going to talk about that and judicial independence. We're lining up a judge, but also a member of the American Bar Association committee that sort of rates and reviews our nominees. Another issue that we generally talk about when we talk about the rule of law is access to justice. Remember that some of our definitions today have talked about everyone is treated equally. What if you need a lot of money to hire a lawyer to be treated equally? Right? What challenges does that pose to the rule of law? And we're going to have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts to discuss that with us, Chief Justice Gans. Don't voting rights play a key role in the rule of law? We talk about free, fair elections. When Americans go abroad and monitor elections. That's usually when we're trying to develop the norm of a rule of law there. And we're going to have two experts that have different positions on whether voting rights are as fundamental and what access to the ballot means. Then we have spring break, so we'll take a week off, followed by a real pressing issue, which is free speech. When we talk about the rule of law, we often talk about societies that respect and encourage free speech. We are going to have the ACLU executive director, and we're also actually looking for someone to take an opposing view. March 21st, we're going to have a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, David Tripman, and a professor here, Laura Leff, talk about truth. How can you have equality and shared norms if you can't agree on the truth, if you can't have a shared reality? Right? On March 28th, we're going to talk about the fact that technological change often outpaces legal regulations. And what happens when you have companies that are outpacing? For example, we have a system when someone gets in a car crash. But what if it's a driverless car? Who's to blame? Who accounts for it? Right? On April 4th, we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, race-based policing. As Dean Paul mentioned, we're going to have the author of the Ferguson report as well as a legal scholar from Columbia. And then on April 11th, we're going to really circle back to a lot of the themes that we've been examining the entire semester, but starting with what we launched today in a session called Rule of Law, How to Keep It, with an award-winning professor from Harvard Law School. So I hope this sparked a lot of questions that I hope we will be able to answer and debate the entire semester. And thank you all so much for your patience. And we'll see you next week with Mark Fishneck.